Well, with me now to discuss is the founder of Black History School, Elliot Reid, and Director of Studies at the Henry Jackson Society, Sam Ashworth-Hayes. Elliot, can I start with you, please? Do you agree with the idea of teaching kids as young as 5 that they are victims because of the colour of their skin?
So I think you might have been a bit confused, Darren, with what you've read.
I don't think I have.
I'd like to know whether or not you're basing your opinion on the Daily Mail article which you sent to me, or you're actually basing them on the report which was written by Brighton and Hove and Portsmouth.
I'm basing it on what I have read in the press. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So so the issue with the article which you sent over to me is it's trying to collaborate information from multiple different sources, and it's not quite ringing true to what was actually read or what was actually written. So when you actually look at the reports, it's not saying that children as young as 5 should be taught that they're racist. All it said is that children as young as 3 can differentiate between race, and that you can't teach race or the construct of racism too early. And it also advocated that it should be tailored on an individual basis. So, for example, myself, I was called the N-word for the first time when I was probably about 5 or 6. And the teachers didn't have the necessary tools that they needed to educate myself or the fellow pupil on what should have been done at the time. So you can see how teachers in that instant, they might actually do quite well by having some information or some toolkits to educate them on what they could do in that situation.
Sam, honestly, if I give you a personal anecdote, you know, I was horribly bullied at school, and I was called all sorts about my sexuality before I even knew what sexuality was, right? But I don't think that you should introduce topics around sex and gender to kids of that age. I think you teach kids to not call people nasty names. Am I wrong?
So I think you raise an interesting point. I wouldn't say the two are directly comparable in that way. But I do think there is an interesting point which you made, which is that I'm not convinced you combat this sort of behaviour by making race more salient to children. But sort of teaching people at a very young age that one of the most important characteristics they possess is the colour of their skin, and that social interaction should be mediated based upon that, seems to be almost setting people up for failure in a way.
Yeah. So are we setting pupils up for failure, Elliot?
No, because once again, if you actually read the reports, it's not saying that you address racism as racism directly. It's actually talking about celebrating the accomplishments of people from a whole diverse background, which is representative of the British people and obviously representative of the descendants of British subjects. So once again, Darren, I think that you'd probably be good to actually read the reports before you invite me onto a show next time to discuss them.
Well, Elliot, I'm not all that interested about what Brighton and Hove put out about race and gender and all the rest of it, to be quite frank with you, because I think what they're doing with kids is wrong. But do you actually, you must be an ardent supporter of the Conservative Party then, I'm assuming, given how diverse the candidates are in the current leadership election?
It goes a lot further than face value, doesn't it, Darren? I'm not going to vote for a group of people purely based on their race. Otherwise, I might be called racist.
Well, that's certainly what diversity quotas would do, isn't it?
No, Darren, I don't know what box you're trying to put me into, dude. Like, you're trying to pigeonhole me into a certain argument based on what you've read about me or what you think I might represent.
So do you think it's right or wrong, then, that, as Sam says, we are teaching a generation of kids that they are victims? You can surely answer that question.
Darren, no one's advocated that. That hasn't been advocated by Brighton and Hove. It wasn't advocated in the Portsmouth report. It's not been advocated at all. I don't know where you're getting your information from.
OK, so Sam, where are you getting your information from?
Sorry, that's not actually quite what I said, Darren. I was asked, sort of in preparation for this show, if I thought it was a good idea to teach that at that age, which was sort of the question I answered. I think it would be an unhelpful step to introduce it to the younger curriculum.
Yeah, right. OK, so how is that any different to what I've just said? I'm confused.
Sorry, so I think your focus is on victimhood. Yeah, exactly.
Sam,
I think
your line isn't too good, Sam. If you could just try and be as clear as possible.
Of course. I mean, the main thing just to say is that there's a difference between sort of saying someone is a victim and sort of introducing concepts which they may not be sort of completely able to handle at that age. So if you tell someone that they're a victim, that's obviously going to be sort of very bad, but you don't necessarily have to do that to have quite a harmful effect. You could say simply that, for instance, people tend to, you can basically increase the salience of race in their interactions at an early age in a way they're not really equipped to handle. I think that's the sort of thing we really want to avoid.
So, Sam, do you think the solution here is a potential solution about giving parents, for example, more of a say over whether their children are taught about various issues around, it could be racist, it could be sex, gender, you name it? Do you think that's the solution?
I think that's not the worst option, and it's quite interesting actually, because we've sort of seen the government recently sort of tightening up the ways in which parents do have some control over what their kids are being taught, particularly sort of with the current sort of education bill, which is pushing back against homeschooling in quite a significant way. So, the idea of some sort of local oversight is not one that I'd be opposed to at all. I think it'd be quite effective actually, particularly as well in that I tend to find that people are quite good at forming communities and getting along together without sort of excessive government overreach. And this seems to be quite a good way of sort of pushing back against some of that.
Yes, because Elliot Poland suggests that 69% of parents think schools shouldn't be teaching in a non-partisan way, whilst 38% do not think pupils should be taught that Britain is structurally racist. So I'm wondering, do you believe it is important for kids to be told that this is an institutionally racist country?
The issue is that people don't know what they don't know. So, for example, a recent poll, it was a few years ago, the British public, about 60%, voted that the British Empire was a good thing, for example, which is statistically, anecdotally, qualitatively, completely incorrect.
In your opinion, that is an opinion.
No. It's not in my opinion. It's not in my, trust me, Darren, it's not in my opinion. If you wanted to go through the facts, we can go through the facts. But it wasn't a good thing. When it comes to the...
I'm sorry, that is the very definition of an opinion, what you have just said. You can't say it's not an opinion.
So let's go through let's go through the data, right? So when it comes to the countries that are occupied by the British Empire, every single one of them,
right,
apart from those
Elliot,
occupied
I'm sorry, but what you are teaching kids right now, or proposing that we teach kids at least, is that you are going back, telling them that they are victims today. We are no longer in an imperial power that is a colonial power that is subjugating entire nations and people. We aren't doing that. Ancestors way down the line maybe were part of that, but you cannot tar the future generations with the sins of their ancestors.
No, that once again, you're misconstruing what I've said. I've never said that, Darren. I don't know what you think I'm saying. I'm not saying that at all.
I've just asked you whether or not you think we should be teaching about those issues. You said, yes, we should be teaching that the British Empire is a bad thing, in your opinion.
We should be teaching... So we should, as I agree with Sam, we should be giving children facts on both sides and letting them come up with the conclusion.
Right, but it is the fact that the Empire did good and bad. That is an opinion.
If we were to have an actual debate about this, I assure you, you would end up on the losing side when it comes to whether or not the British Empire was a good thing. It's very, very difficult to justify. Just like there's going to be a few people...
Do you know what, Elliot? I won't lose over when... That is your opinion.
Darren,
that is your opinion.
There's going to be a few people who think the Nazi Party was a good thing, but the vast majority of people know that it wasn't.
What a ridiculous thing to say.
You've got evidence on both sides, but I assure you it's not a very strong argument on your part.
Absolutely ridiculous hyperbole there. Sam, do you believe that Britain is an institutionally racist country?
I don't, in the sense that I don't think the term institutionally racist, as it's often thrown around, has a great deal of meaning at all.
So then how should we teach the Empire?
I think they're slightly distinct topics, but just if I could just briefly say something about institutional racism, actually, and I'll come on to the Empire, if that's okay. I think a lot of the narrative we kind of have at the moment is sort of copy-pasted almost directly from some of the discourse in America, both on sort of the pro side and the anti-side here. And I think that's just hugely damaging, frankly, because it doesn't really apply to British history, and it certainly doesn't apply to the British population. The vast majority of non-black people who've arrived in Britain have come over the past century seeking economic opportunity and have generally done quite well, compared to the sort of population I was here previously. It's not the same as the history of sort of slavery in America, and in particular, sort of the legacy that's institutionally.
Indeed.
In terms of how I would teach the Empire, I mean, look, there is a case to be made that globally it came out net positive, which I think Neil Ferguson did quite ably in his book Empire. And you will find people on both sides. Generally, I think people tend to come down the side that it's, a deeply immoral enterprise. But if you will take these long-term utilitarian views, you will get people like Neil who will push an alternative. I think it's useful to give people both sides that and actually let them discuss it.
Yeah, both sides. It's almost like it's an opinion, isn't it, Elliot?
So I think, so if I can just expand on the point that was made about whether or not Britain is institutionally racist, absolutely right. There's very, very different colonial history between Britain and America. America really did rely on institutional racism, for example, when you've got essentially apartheid, Jim Crow, which wasn't really present in the UK, but it was present more culturally. So I'd say that although racism isn't written into British law, it's not written into British systems, culturally there is a lot of evidence to suggest that Britain has an issue when it comes to race. So, for example, if someone has, for example, 70% more individuals with an ethnic last name need to hand in 70% more CVs to get the same number of callbacks. That was conducted by Oxford and Cambridge, a replicable study, random control study, blinded study. So,
okay.
Once again,